King Philip's War. Almost zero Americans today have heard of King Philip's War. I didn't know anything about King Philip's War as an undergraduate at George Fox back in the Dark Ages. I didn't know anything about King Philip's War as a grad student at the University of Washington. Yes, go Dogs. So I started learning about King Philip's War actually in my teaching career. This is often the way. Most professors, if they're honest, they will tell you about learning while they're teaching. Right? So, King Philip's War, though, is the most important conflict of the 17th century. And if it had turned out differently, the history of the United States would have been dramatically different. This is a serious war, King Philip's War. The Puritans of both Plymouth and the Bay Colony, and the Bay Colony was established 10 years after Plymouth in what we now call Boston, 1630. And so you need to think of the Bay Colony as being a separate colony from Plymouth. The Bay Colony is a little bit north of Plymouth, but they're not the same entity. They're both Puritans. The Plymouth Colony is, of course, Pilgrims, but the Bay Colony is just the basic Puritan brand of Christianity. And these two colonies lived side by side with the Native Americans of that region, the various tribes, and there are dozens of them, in a precarious but consistent peace. There were some hostilities, but generally minor. No major wars. The whites increased in numbers, and the Indians declined in numbers over the 50 years or so, from 1620, when the Pilgrims landed, to 1675, when King Philip's War began. So we're about 55 years here. A good long generation. And so the Indians are declining, largely because of disease. And as long as the Indians were willing to sell some of the land that they controlled to the various Puritans, then things were relatively calm. But the Puritans are buying land from the Native Americans. This is unlike some places in the New World in which the white people are just taking the land. But the outcome of such a policy of gradually selling off one's land, the Indians eventually saw, would eventually lead to the end of their way of life. It's not like they can just move out west. There are other Indian tribes out there who would see that as a very dim turn of events, right? And so there's only a limited amount of land. Meanwhile, the Puritans made a sincere effort to convert the Native Americans to Christianity. And so in this sense, they're seeing the Native Americans as humans, as human beings equal and deserving of the salvation of the Christian faith. Now, they don't always treat the Native Americans this way, but at least in this sense, they did. And the converts numbered in the thousands. And so this is a very successful, if you know anything about the missions of the Christian church over 2 millennia, this is a successful attempt to convert indigenous people to the Christian faith. You may run across an historian who says that it wasn't, but that defies all other research. And so the converts, numbering in the thousands, were established in what were called praying towns. And so not only was this a conversion to Christianity in terms of the faith, but also to white culture. They're established in praying towns. And now in 1657, 37 years after the Pilgrims first landed, and again, I'm not going to ask you a date like that on the exam, but I want you to get the sense of the passage of time here. William Bradford died, had lived there and was governor of Plymouth for almost his entire life. And about the same time, Massacre, chief of the Poconokeets, legend has it that he simply decided to give up his role as leader of the Poconokeets, and he walked into the wilderness. And so now leadership passes to a new generation, and that's when all the trouble starts, or most of it. Declension. That is a great word, declension. It's a fancy way of saying decline. And usually it refers to a decline of spiritual fervor, of commitment, in this case, to the Christian faith. Declension. The original pilgrims had been driven by fiercely held spiritual beliefs. It could not have been otherwise to do what they did. And the magnitude of the original Puritan purpose, the significance of their accomplishments, could not likely be repeated by their sons and daughters and grandkids. Think of being the son or daughter of a famous athlete, or a movie star, or a great politician, right? President of the United States. How are you going to live up to that? Difficult. Consequently, the second generation suffered under the assumption, as their ministers never tired of telling them in sermons, that they were unequal to their mothers and fathers, that they were not equal to the call that God was giving them. In other words, they had declension. Such a sermon has a name. It's called a Jeremiad, after the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, who spent his ministry calling the people of Israel to reform, to stop the declension and reform themselves. Hence, Jeremiad. The chief sin seemed to be a desire for the luxuries of this world. For material gain, more land, better crops, bigger barns. Perhaps being able to buy the imports from Great Britain, because the products coming from Great Britain were generally better than the basic products that could be provided here in the New World at this time, and would be for, well into the early American period. Clothes, jewelry, perfume, and in a culture in which baths are not taken every week, perfume is kind of essential. Better shoes, the latest cell phone. No, that's not true. If some disaster now befell the people of New England, remember they're hearing these Jeremiads now, reform, repent, it would be impossible to escape the conclusion that who was angry? That God was angry at this decline. That God had judged the people in the midst of this disaster, whether it was a storm or a war or famine or whatever it might be. That God had judged these people just as he had judged Israel over 2 millennia before in the Babylonian captivity, when the Babylonians swept into the land of Israel and took Israel captive off to Babylon. And of course, these people see themselves as the new Israel, and so the comparison was always in front of them. In addition to their spiritual decline, the Pilgrims made another mistake. This one is probably even more telling. But perhaps this mistake is related to the spiritual decline. They no longer believed that their future depended on the support of the Poconokeets or other Indian tribes. Remember that Bradford and the Pilgrims, they were absolutely certain that that alliance was necessary to their survival, and they were right. Problems. The sale of lands went on, year after year, decade after decade. The Puritan colonies now expanding to the west and to the north and to the south. Increasingly, Philip's people became alarmed at their smaller and smaller domain, their shrinking lands. And Philip himself became less and less popular with his own people because it's Philip, of course, who was selling the lands off. But Philip believed he had little choice in this. Philip is using the money to buy arms, that is, guns, from the English. Guns that he then uses to keep other tribes under control. And remember how Massacre had even struggled with this. Phillip even more so, because he's not the leader that his father was. Apparently there was declension in other aspects of New England as well. And so he needs the guns. And then, too, the white people did not like to hear the word no when they asked to buy more land. There's pressure here. For their part, the sons and daughters of the original Pilgrims and Puritans seem not to have realized that by continually pushing the Indians until they had no choice but to push back, the colonists were unintentionally then preparing the way for a massive conflict. Then, too, continued large immigration, and then a high birth rate because life is generally good. Food is plentiful in New England. So there's a high birth rate and immigration that's adding to the population, and thus the need for what? More land. More land. In the early 1670s now, Phillip continued gathering weapons and attempted to organize other tribes into an even stronger alliance than the one he already had, with the intent of eventually launching a war against the Pilgrims and the Puritans of the Bay Colony. He's just biding his time until he feels he's strong enough. But as it turned out, events are going to take a turn that Phillip himself doesn't even really want. He's not ready, but history seldom takes note of such things. In January 1675, a native convert by the name of John Sassamon, and this was normal in these times, if you became a convert, you took on a Christian name, John. But he's a Native American. He's a Pokanoket. Even Phillip is a good example of this. Philip's original name was Metacomet. But while Phillip is not a convert, he wanted to appease the English to a certain extent, so he took on the name Phillip, right? So don't be confused by that. Phillip is a full Pokanoket, the son of Massacre. Well, John Sassamon was perhaps the most outstanding Christian convert that the Pilgrims could point to say that their efforts at conversion were bearing fruit. He could speak English, he could read English, he understood the Christian faith. And now he goes to Plymouth to warn them that Phillip intended war sometime soon. The Pilgrims did not believe Sassamon. Very easy to convince yourself, this is a very human trait, that no trouble is coming. We don't want to believe trouble is coming because it's going to disrupt our lives if we begin to believe that. We'll have to do something different. We'll have to take action. It can't happen to me. See? And so we do things that we know are not safe, not wise, not good. Well, a few days later, Sassamon's body is found floating in a pond. Who killed him? Well, who do you think? The Pokanokets had learned that Sassamon had gone and warned the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims now found a witness who claimed to have seen 3 Pokanokets kill Sassamon. Eyewitness. So the 3 were arrested, they were tried, and they were hanged. In spite of the fact that English law requires 2 witnesses in a capital case. But in this case, the English just ignored that requirement. The Pokanokets, now learning what has happened to 3 of their warriors, are enraged. Phillip would lose his position if he did nothing. The crown always sat unwarily or uneasily on Philip's head. So now, in spite of the fact that he's not quite ready, he feels he has no choice but to go to war. And so on a Sunday morning in June 1675, the Indians now attacked deserted houses at a place called Kikamuit. Now, the houses were deserted. Nobody there. Because the settlers had learned that there was probably going to be an attack. And so they had gone to a stronghouse, right? A fortress. And they had left their farms. And the Plymouth colony now sent word to the Bay colony to the north, come and help us. And the Bay colony obliged, meaning they agreed, yes, we will. And so what happens then is, you see there are no standing armies, no professional soldiers in these colonies. Every able-bodied man is a soldier, a member of the militia. Now, hopefully this is a word that is familiar to you if you've been reading April Morning. April Morning takes place 100 years in the future from this time, 1775. This is 1675, so it's exactly 100 years. But still, in terms of defense, the colonists rely on themselves and their militia. And so when the sound goes out, the alarm goes out for the militia to gather, then the men grab their guns, leave their homes, and they show up on the town green, okay, the center of the town. Well, that's what happens here. The militia is organized, just as it would be 100 years in the future. So I want you to understand the context of April Morning. This is the eve of the American Revolution. This is the events in a day and a half that become the so-called shot heard around the world, right? Yeah. That will eventually lead to war. But back to King Philip's War. The militia then, the summer soldiers, the amateurs, are forming up. And the Bay Colony is responding to the call for help from Plymouth. The governor of Plymouth also ordered a day of prayer and fasting, saying, "We humble ourselves before the Lord for all those sins whereby we have provoked our God sadly to interrupt our peace and comfort." So there's some sense here in which they have brought this on themselves. We provoked our God. Forgive us, O Lord. But there was no sense that one of the chief sins was the way the Pilgrims and the Puritans were treating the Native Americans. Maybe it's because we're drinking too much or we like our clothes too well. Now on the following Wednesday, a boy and his father attempted to retrieve goods from their farmhouse that they had left to go to the protection of the strong point. So they're going back to their farmhouse, and they notice a few Indians off in the distance. And so the boy decides, and he's armed, he decides to level his musket and fire at one of the Native Americans. And the Indian falls. As it turned out, a very unlucky shot. The next day, the Indians attacked the settlement, the stronghouse at nearby Swansea. At least 10 settlers, including the boy who fired the first shot, were killed at Swansea. So trouble has turned to war. Blood has been spilled. Meanwhile, the combined forces of the colonies now, the militia army, marched towards Swansea to rescue those who were besieged. As they moved south, they were shocked by the carnage they saw in the countryside because the war had spread already. There were heads cut off and placed on the stumps of fence posts, and scalps on the rails, and hands cut off and placed on the fences as well, of white people, of the settlers. It's terrifying. It was supposed to be terrifying. And try as they might, the colonial army could not catch Philip. And it wasted time because they're scared. They waste time building forts every night, some kind of rudimentary barracks, maybe in some places even a stronger kind of fortress that they might retreat to in case of trouble. So that takes time to fell the trees, and it's just way too slow. They're never going to catch Philip like that. And maybe Just maybe they don't really want to, right? Philip knew they were coming. He left his base on the peninsula at Mount Hope, which is down at the bottom of the map there. And I'm not going to test you on, the map and where these places are, but get a basic idea. You can see where Plymouth is and where Boston is, and that most of the fighting is out west and maybe to the southwest a little bit. You can see the battle star where the great swamp fight is out there. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm not going to ask you on the test what happened at the great swamp fight. This is 350 years ago, and who died at the great swamp fight is not really relevant. It's just part of the story, though, okay? And so the question naturally arises, well, why don't you just tell us what you want us to know for the test and we get out of here? That would be what? Causes and what did I say the other day? Results, okay? So you sat down this morning, you knew you were going to get a lecture on King Philip's war. The first thing you should have thought to yourself, what I need to know is the cause of this war. I need to know the results of this war because that might have relevance to me 350 years in the future. It might, okay? That's what you needed to be thinking. If for no other reason than I'm telling you now, and I've told you in the days before, that that's what I am going to put on the test. Okay? And that's going to help make you a better student. You apply that kind of logic to every class. What is the most important thing here? Whether it's sociology or economics, philosophy, religion, whatever. You learn to think like that, you're going to think like a college student then. So, they can't catch Philip, and Philip now, he's cagey. He marches his soldiers, his warriors, back to the east and back towards Plymouth for a ways. That's not where the colonial militia thinks he's going to be going, right? He's circling around underneath them and then around behind them, and he's picking up allies all along the way of the other tribes. Then the colonists made picking up allies for Philip easy. You would think this would be a contest between who could get the most allies, right? It should have been. It didn't have to be a race war. It was likely to be, but it didn't have to be. Because the colonists made the mistake of treating all the Indians, even the Indians who had been friendly, even Indians who were converts to Christianity, they began to treat them all as if they were enemies. In other words, the colonists made it a race war. So here we can see where race is predominant. It's primary. It didn't start over race, it started over what? Bottom line. The pressure over the land. Thank you very much. Yes, it was about the land issue, okay? If it hadn't been for the land issue, then this would not have led to war. Race doesn't start it, but race is going to inflame it, okay? Now, Indians actually journey to Plymouth to offer their services in the war to help the Pilgrims. And what did the Pilgrims do? They put them in jail and made slaves out of them. Yeah. A horrible decision. Most tribes in the region now see no reason to help the white people. They have to align themselves with the other Indians. Even if there were hatreds and animosities between tribes, which there were, but the whites have pushed them all together. Now came Indian attacks throughout New England, so this has become a regional war. Meanwhile, the colonial army could not find Philip. He was making his way, after he'd moved back into the east and then to the north towards Plymouth, and then he moved back to the west towards the Nipmunks up in the northwest, of New England, where he hopes to make an alliance with the powerful Nipmuc tribe. And he did. So Philip is getting stronger. The colonists are losing this war. In September of 1675, Boston, the big city, declared a day of, I quote, public humiliation, repentance. The people were told to refrain from, and I quote now from the proclamation, intolerable pride in clothes and hair, and the toleration of what? So many taverns. Now remember, Puritans are not Quakers. They enjoy a beer or stronger liquid. In fact, you know what the apple crop, where the apple crop of New England ended up at this time? Hard apple cider. That's what they do with their apples, except for the occasional pie. Okay? And so a lot of taverns, too many for the preachers. So refrain from intolerable pride in clothes and hair and the toleration of so many taverns. God is not happy with us because of these things, the preachers are saying. Nevertheless, the next day after this proclamation, 57 English colonists were killed as they tried to flee their farms to the safety of the strong houses. They didn't make it. The people of Massachusetts now turned their anger, their fear, on the Christian praying Indians, their friends, their converts. They were collected and shipped out into Boston Harbor at a place called Deer Island, an island prison, where hundreds of them died of starvation and exposure. Fear does incredibly stupid things to people. Now the colonists made another mistake. They decided to attack perhaps the most powerful tribe in New England, the Narragansetts, way out to the southwest. And so the army begins to march towards the Narragansetts. And the Narragansetts are led by a chief by the name of Canonshea. And Canonshea today and for 350 years has the respect of almost any historian or people who are familiar with his story or the history of New England. He's like another Massasoit, whereas Phillip is usually seen in the opposite light. Canonshea. A major battle ensues out there between the Narragansetts and the colonial army called the Great Swamp Fight. Both sides suffered over 20% casualties in the Great Swamp Fight, yes.
Why would King Philip be looked at kind of disparagingly by historians? This seems like he was provoked.
Because well, you'll see in just a few more minutes a little bit more about King Philip. But he's not particularly courageous. He's not particularly wise. Even his own people had grown to disrespect him by the time the war broke out. That's why he was having such a difficulty holding on to his position as leader of the Pokanokets. Okay, good question. "20% casualties. Twice as many as American forces suffered on Omaha Beach in June 1944. D-Day. 10%. So this is brutal, hand-to-hand combat with virtually no medical attention if you're wounded. Instead of saving New England, colonial racism had only increased the danger. In the spring now, after a year of war of 1676, Plymouth Colony once again felt the cold metal of raw hatred as Indian tomahawks fell on Captain Thomas Pierce's company of 80 men. 80 men, significant number. 80 men, Pierce's reconnaissance, that is scouting party, a scouting party in force, 80 men, not 2 or 3. Thought to be pretty much impervious to any normal Indian attack, 80 men. That's why they sent 80. But it wasn't. Because they ran into Canon Shea and his entire tribe coming east towards Plymouth. Bad luck. Doesn't matter how good a soldier you are, Canon Shea has 1,500 men. And so they're ambushed and almost entirely annihilated by Canon Shea. But the Pierce Massacre, as it's called, had a fortunate result. Pierce, contrary to what was going on in the rest of the colonies, had Indian friends that he trusted, that trusted him. And since they were relatively far away from the center of the colonies, these people were not put in on Deer Island and so forth, and they were not arrested. They were Pierce's friends. And so they agreed to go on this reconnaissance in force with Pierce, about 20 warriors. And in the slaughter, these men fought superbly, and every one of them perished. Every one of them died next to Pierce. Now, this is an ambush in the brush, in the woods. And in any such situation, a few are going to get away. They're going to crawl away through the brush and the undergrowth. And a few did. A few of the whites. But before they did, they saw Pierce's Native Americans fighting bravely. They reported that to the authorities in Boston and Plymouth. We can trust these people. And so that's the significance of the Pierce Massacre. Some Native Americans, at the cost of their lives, proving that they could be trusted. Finally now, the leaders of the Bay Colony realized that perhaps the Christian praying Indians on Deer Island and other Indian, like Pierce's Indians, could be of great service to the colonial army. Maybe it's not too late. And amazingly, offered the chance to fight. Many of these Native Americans took the chance. I say amazingly, would you? Your family perhaps incarcerated on Deer Island, perhaps your wife has died of disease, or your children. Are you going to fight for the whites? Some do. Frontiersman Benjamin Church persuaded another small tribe, the Saconets, to join the English. And again, he had a long-term relationship with these people. Pierce is a frontiersman. He lives out a ways into the wilderness, and he persuades the Saconets to help him. The war chief of the Saconets said to Church, and I quote now from Church's memoir, "Sir, if you'll please to accept me and my men and will head us, we'll fight for you. And we'll help you to Philip's head before Indian corn is ripe." In other words, before the harvest. And capturing Philip. I'm going to go back and talk about the capture of Canon Shea, because there's one other element here that leads the Pilgrims and the Puritans to decide that, hey, maybe we need these Indians to help us. So Canon Shea is on his way to Plymouth, as I already said, and the Pierce ambush has already taken place when the authorities in Plymouth are told by some friendly Indians that they can lead a small army to capture Canon Shea. Small army. Because Canon Shea is not with his 1,500. He has isolated himself away from the 1,500 with only a small group of warriors. And these Native Americans know where he's at. And so that's exactly what they do. These Indians lead some members of the militia to capture Canon Shea. So he's taken prisoner, and now the English hope to use Canon Shea to hopefully end the war. And so they offer Canon Shea his life. Tell us where Phillip is. Lead us to Phillip, and we will let you live. And Canon Shea, and this is one of the reasons he's admired, tells the pilgrims in the modern vernacular to go pound sand. No. No, I will not do it. And were it not for this microphone strapped to my chest, I would pound my chest the way Canon Shea did when they stood him up in front of a firing squad. We are going to have you executed if you don't tell us. Canon Shea says, very well, go ahead. So now the pilgrims got a Native American firing squad to shoot Canon Shea. Yeah, friendly Indians, okay? And so he stood there like this, glaring at them. And took the bullets. But he's not going to help them. But of course, Canon Shea was captured with the help of who? Friendly Indians. So you had Canon Shea's capture, you had the Pierce massacre, you had more than enough proof to show that Indians will help us if we'll just treat them right. Amazingly, at this late point, capturing Phillip. And so now the English have a new strategy of making as many friends with the Indians as they can make. The exact opposite of what they did at the beginning of the war. Benjamin Church, not surprisingly, was the most successful captain and the most aggressive in using the Native Americans. Hearing that Phillip was back near Plymouth, Church set out after him. He's not too far away. Now, Phillip had many Indian enemies. And here is an answer in part to the question posed earlier. Why was Phillip not so popular? Any leader has enemies, no matter how good. Phillip wasn't particularly good, so he had more than his share. Customary Indian punishment, of course, is death. There's no prisons in Indian culture. Right? And so if you're seen as disloyal to Phillip, it's death. That's going to leave relatives who are not too pleased. So it was a relative of a warrior that Phillip had executed who says now to the whites that he can lead them to where Phillip is. Revenge. One of the most basic of human emotions. And so Church sets out with several dozen militiamen to capture Phillip. And they find the camp. The Indian is right. He knows where Phillip is at. It's in the swamp. Church assigned a small group to attack the camp while the rest of his force surrounded all of the Indians in the early morning stillness and the damp of the fog. This way, no matter where the Indians ran, they're going to run into the soldiers. And Church knows Phillip. Phillip is already well known for the fact that at the sound of the guns, what's he going to do? He's going to run. He's not going to run to the sound of the guns, which is what a hero does, runs into the flaming building. He's going to run away. And so you surround all the Indians. He's going to run into somebody. Just be ready. So Phillip does exactly as Church expected when the firing started. He ran, and he ran right into 18-year-old, exactly the age of some of you, most of you, I suspect, 18-year-old Caleb Cook. Caleb Cook's not a professional soldier. He's militia. Can you imagine being Caleb Cook? You've got your big musket, and out of the fog, you see something running at you. You're told to be ready. It's an Indian at least, and so there you are, and it's probably shaking like this. And So when he thinks he's got him in his sights, Caleb Cook presses a trigger, and it didn't make that sound. Nothing. Basic rule of 17th century warfare: keep your powder dry. Hard to do in the mist and the fog and the damp. And Caleb Cook didn't. Gun doesn't go off. Now the Indian, whoever he is almost on them when all of a sudden Caleb Cook hears right in his ears, bam! And the Indian almost falls at his feet. You see, standing right behind Caleb Cook is the legacy, the story, the moral of King Philip's War. Who do you think fired that shot? A Native American named, don't be surprised now, Alderman. It's not a Native American name, is it? Why is his name Alderman? He's a praying Indian, most likely. Okay. Fired the shot. King Philip is dead. Caleb Cook lives. If it's not for the use of the Native Americans as allies, Alderman's not there. The battle's over. Church now ordered Philip's body quartered. Yes, they cut his body in fours. This is 17th century, folks. Life is brutal. Life is often short. They cut off his head. They put his head on a pole, and they marched it back to Plymouth. Once they got back to Plymouth, they put his head on a high pole in the fortress around the town. And it stayed there. The crows had picked it clean, and it's nothing but a skeleton for 20 years. Philip's death, Canon Shays' death, the new English strategy of using the Native Americans as allies instead of enemies, brought victory in King Philip's War, even though the fighting continued for a few more months. But the war was essentially over with Philip's death. The key to victory is, what do you think? What? Yeah, use of allies. And this is the beginning of a long American tradition. This is essentially a foreign war, and in foreign wars, not Civil War, okay, but in foreign wars, the American people have been most successful when they have engaged the foe with allies. We don't win the American Revolution without allies. The French, the Spanish, the Dutch. Yeah. If it's not for the French and the Spanish and the Dutch, George Washington is hanged as a traitor. And we're all still speaking English. Yeah, my little sense of humor there. But we don't say cheerio, do we? Or jolly good show. No, because of allies. World War I, allies, the French and the English. World War II, allies, the French and the English. The Russians, yes, even the Russians are allies in World War II. That's a little advertising for History 152 there. How could the Russians be allies of Americans? That's not American. No, that's not right. Yes.
You said that was the ultimate significance of the war.
Well, we also learned that wars are often caused by?
Land disputes.
Yeah, land disputes. Okay. History of the American West. See? Land disputes are common causes of wars, but you're right. One of the great legacy of this conflict is oftentimes the necessity of allies. Okay. Think that's significant? To know that? Yeah. Today we often debate, do we need allies or not? Yeah. Should we wait for our allies? The cause of the war? Land. The war exacerbated by what? Racism. Very good. And then one of the great legacies of the war, the use of allies. Winston Churchill, most of you know probably, the great leader of Great Britain during the Second World War, when he created this wonderful and effective alliance, absolutely necessary to beat the Nazis and the Japanese. That Churchill quote is a great insight into the difficulty of maintaining an alliance. And it is difficult, okay? But the absolute necessity in case of World War II with that alliance. If it hadn't been for that alliance in the Second World War, the Germans would have won. The Japanese would have taken their part of the world. And the man on the high castle would not be fiction. Results of the victory. The English victory in King Philip's War, of course, secured New England to the colonists, to the white people. It had been a terrible war. Close to 8% of the white male population had died. 8%. Along with absolutely hundreds and hundreds of women and children. This is a terrorist's war on both sides. Okay? Villages wiped out, both sides. In World War II, the United States lost just under 1% of our soldiers and virtually no civilians. So 8% during King Philip's War, less than 1%, and all soldiers in World War II. So you could see that 8 times as deadly King Philip's War as the Second World War. And the war waged on what at that time was colonial soil, by and large, some of the Native American lands as well, of course, had severely damaged New England's economy. Destroyed that many people, that many farms, towns, etc. And that economy would not recover for decades. In the Second World War, how much of American soil is destroyed? Pearl Harbor. That's it. Yeah. The Indians had suffered even more. We don't have accurate figures for how many Indians killed. Perhaps 70% of the tribal population of New England is destroyed. And I suspect a lot of them moved west and were either enslaved by other tribes or were brought into other tribes. Okay? Pushed out, though. Philip's homeland was sold off to investors from the Bay Colony. Plymouth itself was so weakened, Plymouth now, as opposed to the Bay Colony, Plymouth was so weakened by this war that within a few years it is absorbed into the Bay Colony. So the people of Plymouth lost their independence. It was not their intent to be part of the Bay Colony. Even though they're both Puritans, they're still different enough. The Pilgrims have no interest in that. But it's forced on them because they lose this war. Ironically, the failure to live in peace with the Native Americans had cost Plymouth its independence. And of course, it had cost the Native Americans their independence as well.